Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y todas. Vamos a empezar entonces con la mesa redonda 1. Y what a better way to finish the day, to switch language. So just to relax, just to relax, let's do it in English. And of course we do this in English because we have the great opportunity to have France Mele here, so it's a great occasion to exchange with her about the topics that we are discussing today. Of course, Iram too, but Iram speaks both languages. Unfortunately, Marcela Agudelo Botero was our third invite to the round table, but she is not feeling well, so let's hope she recovers soon. So we are going to change a bit the dynamic of the activity, and this time the third participant are you, okay? So what we are going to do is we have a series of questions, 4 topics. We are going to start by France is going to intervene and give her opinions, then Iram, and then we open the table to the public. You can either ask new questions or either give your opinion to complement their answers. We are going to moderate this with Victor Manuel, and we have thought about several questions that are very hard, and as Franz said, they were very tricky, and that's the idea because we have these big brains here, so we have to exploit them as much as possible. So I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers today, and this is a very summarized way because they have done so much that this is not enough, but it's what we have. So Iram Beltran Sanchez is professor at the Department of Community Health Science at the UCLA, Fielding School of Public Health, where he also co-directs the Center for Population Studies and the Center for Biodemography and Population Health. He's a co-founder of the Latinoamerican Mortality Database, LAMDA, that we use a lot, the most comprehensive repository of mortality data for the region since 1850. His research explores population health, aging, demographic data production, and methods for population studies. In 2018, he received the Early Career Achievement Award from the Population Association of America, and he is the only Latin American scholar that have received this distinction up to date. France Mele, she's directrice de recherche en EDIT, Institut National d'Études Démographiques, INED, in Paris. She's a physician and demographer by training, and we can see that, of course, by the quality of her research and the comprehensive way. She has been a leading figure in the study of mortality, causes of death, health crisis, and longevity, with a focus on long-term trends in Europe and the former Soviet Union. Her work on the health transition, particularly divergence, convergence dynamics, and old age mortality, has been highly influential. She received the 2024 Award for Population Studies of the European Association for Population Studies, and also she was awarded as the 2025 IUSSP laureate. Also, something that I want to highlight of both of them is that they have been very active in producing data. France is very active in the HMD, the Human Mortality Database, and also the Cause of Death database, International Cause of Death database. And Iram, of course, with the Lambda project, so that is very interesting. And also they have worked a lot in theories about epidemiological transitions and convergences, divergences, etc. So I think this is it's going to be a very fruitful discussion. So we are going to talk about 4 main topics. The first one is stale gains in life expectancy and the promise and dilemmas of medical innovations. The second one is emerging inequalities and divergent patterns. The third one is the challenges of data and surveillance. And the fourth, the priorities that should guide future research and public health policy. Okay? So let's start by the first one. And this is 2 questions in one. And as I said, are very tricky and very complex. But let's say,
Thank you, Enrique. First, thank you to the organizer for inviting me to this challenging roundtable, I would say. And second, I really apologize to oblige everyone to speak in English now. This is not my native language too, but unfortunately, I don't know enough or even not at all Spanish or Portuguese to be able to discuss these different points in a language which would be more comfortable for you. So we will go on with English, and I will try to do my best. Third, I would like to say also that I will not answer the questions. Don't hope that you will have the solution at the end of the debate. Maybe Hiram can, but what I would like to do is just to discuss with you what we know historically, because as it was said, I have spent a lot of time just to look at the history of mortality and especially of causes of death, to try to understand the present and maybe to forecast a little the future. But I am still looking at that, and I am not, it's not magic. I cannot tell you what will occur in the next even in the next weeks and less for the next months or years. But then if we start from the recent stagnation in life expectancy, and it's true that in most advanced countries, it seems that there is some slowing down of progress in the recent years, and especially in the decade 2010. How can should we be surprised by this stagnation? So I would say no. In fact, I am not surprised. And if you go back to some publications which occurred in the 2000s, the first one was by a very well-cited publication by Jim Uppen and Jim Vopol about the broken limits of life expectancy. And I imagine everybody here knows this publication, but just to say, they showed that the maximum life expectancy had been increasing very regularly since the middle of the 19th century. So it was a straight line, and they imagined that it would never stop, or maybe stop, but in a very far future. But then, a few years later, with Jacques Vallin, we produced another paper, which was called the segmented line of life expectancy. So we redo the same work as had been done by Uppen and Vopol, but we increased the sources, and also we had some critical look at the sources, and changing the sources and increasing them, we showed that so it was life expectancy had been progressing since the beginning of the 19th century, but that at the same time it hadn't been always progressing at the same pace, and that the slope was changing from time to time according to the changes in medicine, in economic progress, and a lot of things. And so our conclusion at that time was that, yes, it's progressing. We can hope that it will still progress, but we don't know at which rhythm, and this rhythm can change from time to time. And so what we see in the recent years, it's exactly that, so that the rhythm is slowing down. So that said, it seems not so surprising, but in the same time, it's maybe more difficult to explain that what we have seen or thought at that time, because, and I will come on that and on the different steps of the health transition, but right now it seems that what we observe is not only a new step of the health transition, to say it rapidly, but that it's more diverse and multifactorial than what we could have observed in the past. And just to explain a little more about that, so as I said, it's not the first time that we see such a phenomenon of stagnation or at least slowing down of the progress in life expectancy. And the first one, which is very well documented, what occurred in the 1950s and 1960s, where progress in life expectancy slowed down in the most advanced countries, because it seems that everything which could be gained from the fight against infectious disease had been gained, and it was not possible to go further. And in the same time, there was an increase in the chronic disease, in cardiovascular disease, and the so-called man-made disease. And the idea was that the progress would stop. And this is at that time that Abdel Omran produced the theory of the epidemiologic transition. And so there was this slowing down. And then from the 1970s, there were new progress which occurred, especially due to what was called the cardiovascular revolution. And so this chronic disease, which seemed at that before very difficult to fight and to control, there were new means which were found to fight them. And these means were very diverse. Already it was much more difficult than for infectious disease, because for infectious disease, once we had antibiotics and immunization, it was almost okay. It's a little, I simplify a little, and we will come back to infectious disease maybe later. And for circulatory disease, it was a combination of a lot of different processes, like prevention, and then also new treatments, and even new surgery, etc., and also some better organization of the health system, so also some social factors which help people to take in charge their own health, to be taken in charge for chronic disease, which is rather costly and is not always easy to organize. And this is a reason why at that time, for the cardiovascular regions, some part of the advanced countries were not able at the beginning to follow. And especially it was the case for all the countries of the Eastern Europe and the former USSR, where the system was not adapted at the beginning to fight this chronic disease. But then later, and especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the split of the USSR, most of these countries were able also to enter this cardiovascular revolution and to progress. But now, so is it like that? So that, and this would be the easiest way to explain the stagnation, maybe. We are arriving at a limit for the progress in circulatory disease, or maybe and we need to find something else, and we know that cancer mortality is decreasing, but not so rapidly, and we are still waiting for some important progress in that. And we see also this increase in neurodegenerative disease at all ages, and maybe we need to wait for new progress in these two directions to start a new step of the health transition, which would allow to have a better progress in life expectancy. But as I said, it's much more difficult because there are other things which came on the table in the most recent years. And of course, first there is this new development of infectious disease with the COVID-19 pandemics, but also before there were some rather deadly epidemics of influenza in the most advanced countries. And it appeared that maybe also, because now in these very advanced countries, there were the only people who were dying were very old people. Once again, I simplify, of course, the situation, but that they were very, very frail and also so more susceptible to be touched by such epidemics, and that maybe we would also, for that, have touch a limit. So this is something else, which is and the frailty of these very old people, probably it's not really a question of medicine, but much more a question of being taken in charge by the society in a good manner. And then we have also the case of the United States in the most recent years, in the 2000s, which is not really a new thing, but this is, I would say that they come back to the previous stage of the health transition with a new increase of this man-made disease, as well as it was called by Omran, and consequently also, of course, of the circulatory disease. This is something else because we are coming back to a mortality which is increasing at rather young ages in comparison to what we were observing. And it's a little, we have also a little this case in the United Kingdom, I think. And so this is something which makes also the recent, which could make the recent stagnation different of what we were observing. And finally, and I will stop there and maybe let Hiram go on. It seems that we have also some cohort effect in some countries, in some European countries, and especially in my country, for instance, in France, where there is some bad cohort, or I shouldn't say that, but I am part of this cohort, so it's, I can't say that. So cohorts, it's little difference between males and females, but roughly it's cohorts which were born in the 40s and in the first half of the 50s or something like that, and who seems to have all along their life an increase in mortality in comparison with the cohort before and the cohort after. And so these cohorts are arriving at an age where it becomes a little normal to die, and probably it can be, so this is probably a temporary effect, but it can play also a role in this stagnation. So to conclude, it's a rather complex situation, and at this stage, and you know, in demography we need time to understand the phenomenon, and probably we have not so much right now. It's a little too early, but for public health it's important to know, but it's not exactly the same perspective. So I will stop maybe there, and Hiram, let you go on.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you also for the organizers. So I'm gonna try to address a similar question. I'm gonna take on some points that Franz already mentioned. What I would like to start is to make a distinction between the low middle-income countries or high-income countries, and is different from the low and middle-income ones. When one looks at high-income countries, which are usually the European countries, the Nordic countries, the US, Canada, and some of the Asian countries, China is moving into that direction, I feel that the mortality pattern is quite different. So Franz already alluded a little bit to that mortality declined quite rapidly in the early 1900s, and beginning in the 1950s or so, we have kind of the second revolution of the improvement in mortality, mainly as a result, a lot of that to cardiovascular diseases. We seem to be approaching, I feel, a little bit of the limits to how much we can improve mortality in low mortality settings. And part of the reason is some of the work that I've done recently in which we showed that in low mortality countries, the life expectancy continues to go up. However, the rate at which it is increasing is slowing down. So that's quite a difference. It's not the same to say the life expectancy is not going up. It is going up. However, it is going up slower than what one would thought it was going to be going given the past previous trends. So that slowing down, I think, is different when one looks at these low middle income countries, low mortality countries, I would say. Because what we do know is that in these low mortality countries, the reason why mortality seems to be a little bit complicated to continue going down is because we are now getting to the older age mortality. So in contrast to what used to happen in most countries in which in the early 1900s, we had a lot of infectious diseases, diarrheal diseases, all these kind of diseases that were sort of one disease at a time, and they basically affected early young people. Once we were able to overcome or find cures or treatments for those conditions, life expectancy went up fairly rapidly. However, when one goes now into older ages, we do not have one disease. In older ages, we have a multiplicity of diseases, what we call multimorbidity. And on top of having multimorbidity, we now are reaching ages in which we go into cognitive decline. So now the main issue for medical sciences is what to do with the cognition, because we do not have yet a good way to diagnose many of the mental health conditions, and even less idea how to treat them. There is in fact not really a treatment yet that could reduce the progression of these mental health conditions. So once someone is somewhat diagnosed with, say, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or any of those chronic conditions, the disease is going to progress. We haven't yet been able to delay it or to stop the progression of the disease. So in some of the work that I've done, when we look at these type of countries in which mortality is mainly driven by changes at older ages, that's when we make the argument that unless there is a reduction in the biological process of the body, the biological aging that we called, unless we attack the biological process, it is going to be very difficult to continue to have improvements in mortality because we cannot be treating one disease at a time and be expecting to improve mortality when one has a lot of conditions. It's very complicated to do that, and we haven't been able to do it. So there is a big push now, in the US at least, on trying to look into the biological aging. I don't know if you have seen in the recent literature now indicators along the lines of biological age. So those indicators of biological age now try to take into account the use of biological markers, and these biological markers go all the spectrum that you can imagine, from the simple ones that use typical indicators such as blood pressure, body weight, cholesterol levels, up to indicators that use the proteomics, which is the proteins that one has in the body, through the blood markers, indicators based on DNA methylation that try to address what happens with the methylation at one ages, indicators on meonics that looks at the bacterial components. We have all sorts of indicators that are trying to assess the underlying biological mechanisms, and the idea is we're trying to push that biological process. The biological idea is if one is able to push the biological aging, then one is delaying all chronic conditions at once, and ideally mortality is going to be pushed a little bit forward to the right, in which case we'll be able to live a little bit longer. So there is a big push in the US to do that. One of those mechanisms, and that brings me to the second point, is the GLP-1 agonists. There is a lot of ideas and a lot of excitement in the medical literature and in public health with the GLP agonists, because in clinical trials it has been shown that these agonists, in the most well-known is the Ozempic, but these agonists seem to be really good at reducing a lot of the health risk factors. Particularly, they reduce body weight. They seem to be very good at controlling the glycemia, the blood pressure. They are also very good at lipidemia, all the lipids in the body, reduce inflammation. So if one puts together all the health risk factors, that's basically a reduction in cardiovascular conditions. So from the biological perspective, the GLP-1 agonists seem to be very promising because it's going to attack the biological process. So that is, again, the difference with attacking a disease. Once an individual is taking the GLP-1, that individual is not treating a disease. That individual is treating the biological process that is occurring in the body. In other words, trying to control the underlying physiological deterioration that could happen in the body. And by doing that, the idea is that we are pushing the conditions to older ages. That's kind of the underlying biological processes that one thinks is going to happen. We haven't seen it yet at the population level. And one of the difficulties with the GLP-1 agonists is that most of them have secondary effects. So for example, in some people it produces a dizziness, loss of appetite, so people stop taking the medication. Sometimes what has been shown is that taking this type of medications, although it reduces body weight and controls the lipids, it also leads to loss of muscle mass. So losing muscle mass is not a very good thing when one is older adult, because one of the main health risk factors for disease and for dying at older ages is the fall. One could fall easily, one is walking, loses balance, and just not having enough muscle mass, and then you fall, and then one of the main conditions for that lead up to death. So the loss of muscle mass is unclear what that's going to do, if that is actually going to have an impact on increasing actually mortality in contrast to reducing it. So although there is a lot of promise, we haven't seen yet what the impact is going to be. And from a demographic perspective, it's going to be very complicated to actually try to test whether the GLP agonists are going to be effective at the population level. And the reason is that at least in the high-income countries in which these type of medications are now available, they are being taken almost as if they are over the counter. So that basically means a lot of people buy them online. Nobody is actually treating them or giving them an actual recipe or actually a way of taking it. And then people just take it for some time and then they just stop. So what that means is it's going to be very hard to know at which point people take it, for how long they're going to take it, which conditions they had prior to taking it, and whether in the long run we see improvements or increases in mortality as a result of the GLP agonists. So right now, most of the clinical trials that have been conducted with this particular medication, which by the way already was already approved prior to using it for this purpose. So this is a similar medication as the one that has been typically used, for example, to reduce the impact of a heart attack, in which they usually use these beta blockers and this type of other medication that are very good for controlling what happens in a transient heart attack. And then later we realized that using some of these beta blockers and some of the components that include the rapamycin seem to be important for survival, or seem to be important for the biological process, but we haven't seen yet an impact at the population level. So just to conclude, I feel that it's a very different way to look at the stagnation when one thinks of high mortality countries. High mortality countries means countries like many in Latin America, many in Africa. Those countries will still likely see improvements in survival, just because they still have the option of reducing young mortality, adult mortality potentially, and that is in contrast to what we see now in European countries, in which most of the improvement highly importantly depends on what happens at older ages. And second, it seems that the movement nowadays, at least in the medical sciences, is not to treat diseases. This is what we call kind of the one disease at a time model. That one disease at a time model in the medical sciences is not going to work in older adults. Now the idea is, instead of treating diseases, we're trying to treat the underlying biological process, and this GLP agonist is only one of the possible mechanisms. I just mentioned very quickly the rapamycin. That was one of the promising indicators. You might remember many years ago, 20 or so years ago, the idea of the resveratrol. The resveratrol is the main component, one of the components that is in the red wine. So that's why back then the idea was everybody wanted to drink red wine, just because red wine, just by the nature of the process, it has resveratrol in it. The only caveat there is that the animal models that were used to show that resveratrol was actually important for survival, they used it in unicellular organisms. That was the only caveat. and then we are not by any means a unicellular organism. So when that was translated into how many resveratrol one needed to drink in order to have the impact on survival, it was several bottles of wine per day. When I read several bottles of wine, I was like, well, I might be able to do it. But then when they say it has to be several bottles of wine per day, that's not attainable. So this is all to say that although there has been a lot of promise from the biological areas, biological sciences, on using some of these pharmaceutical mechanisms to try to reduce the biological process, it is still unclear whether we're going to get there. But probably at some point we might be able to come up with a pill that has several of these mechanisms that is going to allow us to drink, to take it, and to push a little bit the underlying physiological deterioration.
Okay, thank you very much to both. I think there are several topics that you overlapped. I find very interesting when Franz says about that this is more multifactorial, is not one disease as before, like infectious disease and the cardiovascular disease, and we are not attacking a new disease, not cancer, not aging related, so it would be like a continuation of the second transition more, if I understand well. And also the cohort effects of these boomers generations in the high-income countries that, of course, are getting into the old ages with high risk and also with behavioral craziness like drugs and alcohol and all these things. And on the side of Hiram, I think this is a very good coincidence with this, not taking this as a new transition, but it seems like a new kind of transition because it's not on one disease, but more in the aging process. So I think this is kind of different, but also a good nuance of this. And also this kind of skepticism about these new drugs in the sense that they're very recent and also some things that are not well known and maybe some drawbacks that could be not beneficial. So I think Franz mentioned something very that I forgot, and it's that we are really talking the international English, that is the bad English. So don't worry if you need to intervene. If you want to add something or whatever, if you don't feel comfortable speaking in English, just speak in your own language and we can translate. So does someone want to add something, to ask a new question related to this topic? Please, Anna, go ahead.
I want to know about climate change now, how climate change can affect the life expectancy. We see that the effect, in fact, the summer is more hot and the winter.
Being able to delay it or to stop the progression of the disease. So in some of the work that I've done, when we look at this type of countries in which mortality is mainly driven by changes at older ages, that's when we make the argument that unless there is a reduction in the biological process of the body, the biological aging that we called, unless we attack the biological process, it is going to be very difficult to continue to have improvements in mortality because we cannot be treating one disease at a time and be expecting to improve mortality when one has a lot of conditions. It's very complicated to do that, and we haven't been able to do it. So there is a big push now, in the US at least, on trying to look into the biological aging. I don't know if you have seen in the recent literature now indicators along the lines of biological age. So those indicators of biological age now try to take into account the use of biological markers, and these biological markers go all the spectrum that you can imagine, from the simple ones that use typical indicators such as blood pressure, body weight, cholesterol levels, up to indicators that use the proteomics, which is the proteins that one has in the body, through the blood markers, indicators based on DNA methylation that try to address what happens with the methylation as one ages, indicators of omionics that looks at the bacterial components. We have all sorts of indicators that are trying to assess the underlying biological mechanisms, and the idea is we're trying to push that biological process. The biological idea is if one is able to push the biological aging, then one is delaying all chronic conditions at once, and ideally mortality is going to be pushed a little bit forward to the right, in which case we'll be able to live a little bit longer. So this is a big push in the US to do that. One of those mechanisms, and that brings me to the second point, is the GLP-1 agonists. There is a lot of, a lot of ideas and a lot of excitement in the medical literature and in public health with the GLP agonists, because in clinical trials it has been shown that these agonists, in the most well-known is the Ozempic, but these agonists seem to be really good at reducing a lot of the health risk factors. Particularly, they reduce body weight. They seem to be very good at controlling the glycemia, the blood pressure. They are also very good at lipidemia, all the lipids in the body, reduce inflammation. So if one puts together all the health risk factors, that's basically a reduction in cardiovascular conditions. So from the biological perspective, the GLP-1 agonists seem to be very promising because it's going to attack the biological process. So that is, again, the difference with attacking a disease. Once an individual is taking the GLP-1, that individual is not treating a disease. That individual is treating the biological process that is occurring in the body. In other words, trying to control the underlying physiological deterioration that could happen in the body. And by doing that, the idea is that we are pushing the conditions to older ages. That's kind of the underlying biological processes that one thinks is going to happen. We haven't seen it yet at the population level. And one of the difficulties with the GLP-1 agonists is that most of them have secondary effects. So, for example, in some people it produces a dizziness, a loss of appetite, so people stop taking the medication. Sometimes what has been shown is that taking this type of medications, although it reduces body weight and controls the lipids, it also leads to loss of muscle mass. So losing muscle mass is not a very good thing when one is older adult, because one of the main health risk factors for disease and for dying at older ages is the fall. One could fall easily when one is walking, loses balance, and just not having enough muscle mass, and then you fall, and then one of the main conditions for that lead up to death. So the loss of muscle mass is unclear what that's going to do, if that is actually going to have an impact on increasing actually mortality in contrast to reducing it. So although there is a lot of promise, we haven't seen yet what the impact is going to be. And from a demographic perspective, it's going to be very complicated to actually try to test whether the GLP agonists are going to be effective at the population level. And the reason is that at least in the high-income countries in which these type of medications are now available, they are being taken almost as if they are over the counter. So that basically means a lot of people buy them online. Nobody is actually treating them or giving them an actual recipe or actually a way of taking it. And then people just take it for some time and then they just stop. So what that means is it's going to be very hard to know at which point people take it, for how long they're going to take it, which conditions they had prior to taking it, and whether in the long run we see improvements or increases in mortality as a result of the GLP agonists. So right now, most of the clinical trials that have been conducted with this particular medication, which by the way already was already approved prior to using it for this purpose. So this is a similar medication as the one that has been typically used, for example, to reduce the impact of a heart attack, in which they usually use these beta blockers and this type of other medications that are very good for controlling what happens in a transient heart attack. And then later we realized that using some of these beta blockers and some of the components that include the rapamycin seem to be important for survival, or seem to be important for the biological process, but we haven't seen yet an impact at the population level. So just to conclude, I feel that it's a very different way to look at the stagnation when one thinks of high mortality countries. High mortality countries means countries like many in Latin America, many in Africa. Those countries will still likely see improvements in survival, just because they still have the option of reducing young mortality, adult mortality potentially, and that is in contrast to what we see now in European countries, in which most of the improvement highly importantly depends on what happens at older ages. And second, It seems that the movement nowadays, at least in the medical sciences, is not to treat diseases. This is what we call kind of the one disease at a time model. That one disease at a time model in the medical sciences is not going to work in older adults. Now the idea is, instead of treating diseases, we're trying to treat the underlying biological process, and this GLP agonist is only one of the possible mechanisms. I just mentioned very quickly the rapamycin. That was one of the promising indicators. You might remember many years ago, 20 or so years ago, the idea of the resveratrol. The resveratrol is the main component, one of the components that is in the red wine. So that's why back then the idea was everybody wanted to drink red wine, just because red wine, just by the nature of the process, it has resveratrol in it. The only caveat there is that the animal models that were used to show that resveratrol was actually important for survival, they used it in unicellular organisms. That was the only caveat. And then we are not by any means a unicellular organism. So when that was translated into how many resveratrol one needed to drink in order to have the impact on survival, it was several bottles of wine per day. When I read several bottles of wine, I was like, well, I might be able to do it. But then when they say it has to be several bottles of wine per day, that's not attainable. So this is all to say that although there has been a lot of promise from the biological areas, biological sciences, on using some of these pharmaceutical mechanisms to try to reduce the biological process, it is still unclear whether we're going to get there, but probably at some point we might be able to come up with a pill that has several of these mechanisms that is going to allow us to drink, to take it, and to push a little bit the underlying physiological deterioration.
Okay, thank you very much to both. I think there are many, several topics that you overlapped. I find very interesting when Franz says about that this is more multifactorial, is not one disease as before, like infectious disease and the cardiovascular disease, and we are not attacking a new disease, not cancer, not aging related, so it would be like a continuation of the second transition more, if I understand well. And also the cohort effects of these boomers generations in the high-income countries that, of course, are getting into the old ages with high risk and also with behavioral craziness like drugs and alcohol and all these things. And on the side of Hiram, I think this is a very good coincidence with this, not taking this as a new transition, but it seems like a more new kind of transition because it's not on one disease, but more in the aging process. So I think this is kind of different, but also a good nuance of this. And also this kind of skepticism about these new drugs in the sense that they're very recent and also some things that are not well known and maybe some drawbacks that could be not beneficial. So I think Franz mentioned something very that I forgot, and it's that we are really talking the international English, that is the bad English. So don't worry if you need to intervene. If you want to add something or whatever, if you don't feel comfortable speaking in English, just speak in your own language and we can translate. So does someone want to add something, to ask a new question related to this topic? Please, Anna, go ahead.
I want to know about climate change now, how climate change can affect the life expectancy. We see that the effect, in fact, the summer is more hot and the winter more cold. Thank you. And I think there's a lot of people dying now in this time. And here in Brazil, we have a lot of problems with, and I think we have increase in the inequalities also. Thank you.
Is there any other questions? So we can accumulate a couple of questions or comments. Please go ahead. I have to use the mic because they are recording, so that's why I'm...
Thank you very much for your thoughts on this. I was wondering, as well as demographers, whether you think what can be done to, or you think whether we should improve also our cause of death statistics and the way we collect them and adjust them even. And I say this because, with the cardiovascular disease change, reductions in the pace of improvement in mortality.
Related with cognition, whether it is Alzheimer's, whether it is Parkinson's, whether it's any other kind of family within the cognitive decline process, usually they are not classified as such, and we don't yet have enough level of detail to do it. So we can still find some cases in which they classify deaths at older ages as natural cause. Natural is not very useful for us to do anything with it. Or sometimes they might classify a death of an older adult as senility. Doesn't exist, such a thing. But if one looks at the ICDs, I think it's probably between the ICD 8 or 9, something like that, when it disappeared as a condition. And yet, in many places, doctors still consider, if they are not geriatricians, they might still say senility, as if it is such a disease. And again, as demographers, there is not much one can do when one has natural causes of senility or diseases associated with older age, that sometimes they're also labeled. So in those cases is when I think we do need a better ICD classification and more training, because it's not going to be that easy to ascertain those kind of conditions. It is in those cases in which I feel the verbal autopsies would be quite important, quite useful, because then one can get a sense. We already have a series of questionnaires that are used in population studies to get a sense of the potential mental health that the individual could have, and a little more longer series of questionnaires to try to identify the potential dementia that the individual could have had. So it is potentially possible that a family member could answer some of those questions, and then what could potentially ascertain a death through a cognitive decline, if not to a particular disease. Some of them are relatively easy, like the Parkinson's, just because of the loss of control of the movements. That is relatively easier to ascertain, but other dimensions might be a little more complicated. So, but I agree that we need to perhaps do a little bit better job going forward in those causes.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was hoping to have like a new transition, and you're talking about a counter transition, because we are losing the control of the environment that was responsible for the first transition, so we are going backwards somehow. Okay, it seems that we can just continue the whole session with these questions, but we need to pass to the next one, so go ahead, Victor.
With this?
Okay.
Yeah, we can keep with this just two questions all the afternoon. But let's move on. And I think behind all these reflections, behind all this discussion, is a sensitive thing about inequalities and divergences, and it's very sensitive in our region. And we prepared these two questions about. We were wondering about your opinion. If we are entering in a new phase of divergence in mortality driven by cardiometabolic diseases, violence, and social inequalities, or are there also emerging signs of convergence? And another question related is if the life expectancy, as we started in the last question, is if the life expectancy is overused as a dominant metric indicator, or what alternative indicators we have, like the years of life lost, entropy, longevity, inequality, multimorbidity, or in order to better capture mortality crisis and convergence processes. So please, Franz.
Okay.
Oh well, yeah, you have to. Yeah.
Yeah, let's change. We're going to change the order then. So let me start with these kind of phases of divergence in mortality. So again, I'm going to continue to emphasize that the difference between countries with high mortality and countries with low mortality. But I think what I find quite interesting when one looks at somewhat convergence that one might see in some of these countries, I think what one needs to keep in mind is the reasons are quite different. So for instance, as I was mentioning, in low mortality settings or countries with high income, part of the stagnation seems to be driven for this older adult mortality that have not been able to improve it much. What that means is although life expectancy increases, it increases very slowly. So what that is doing is in some ways giving enough time for the high mortality in countries to catch up. So the idea is that the convergence, one might think the convergence is that the low mortality, the high mortality countries or low income countries are doing better. They are in some ways doing better, and that's why they seem to be approaching a little bit what the high income countries are doing. But it's not that they're doing so much better that are catching up with the high income countries. It is that they are doing slowly better, but the other ones are doing slowly worse. See what I mean? So this reminds me on some of the work that I did a few years ago, in which I was looking at the sex gap in life expectancy, the difference in life expectancy females and males. And I looked in high-income countries, and when I looked at that difference, it looked like the sex difference was kind of narrowing. So everyone is like, great, men are doing better. Well, they are somewhat doing better, but the reason is females are actually doing worse. So that is not something that we might want. So if one only looks at the gap, it might give the impression that things perhaps are going better, but it's not doing that better. So in the case of divergence mortality or convergence mortality that we have seen in some countries, they, as I said, they do in fact perhaps are doing slightly better, but the reason in some ways is quite different between high-income countries, low mortality countries. And that brings me to the conditions that could potentially be underlying those differences. When one looks at these low mortality countries, there is a lot of the cardiometabolic indicators that are perhaps increasing, and that goes back to the idea of using the Ozempic. There is one reason a lot of the high-income countries are using it, particularly the US, just because they have a high fraction of individuals with obesity. So it is all the underlying physiological conditions that they have, these cardiometabolic conditions in particular, that makes them more likely to be using this type of medications. And that is quite in contrast to some of these other countries in which violence perhaps is one of the potential reasons for having, in some cases in Latin America, or some of the social inequalities that we have seen, very pervasive in the Latin American countries. So in those cases, I feel that the reasons for those convergence or divergence could be quite distinct. It will be, my guess would be that at some point, if in the US or in the high-income countries they are able to come up with medications that delay the progression of mental health diseases like dementias and Alzheimer's, we are going to see a divergence, because then those countries are going to be able to push perhaps mortality to the upwards, again, to older ages, and the other countries that are lagging behind are going to take time to get there, and then we're going to start seeing again a divergence. That is the typical approach that one sees when there is improvement in some medical conditions, in which those who are the early adopters tend to get ahead, while the other ones kind of are lagging behind. So it's going to take, I feel, a lot of time perhaps to get there, in particular in these low-income countries, because fighting these older age mortality is quite complicated. So I'm going to leave it there for now.
Yes, so in terms of inequalities and divergence conversion, I would say that I am rather pessimistic, let's say. So we theorize the fact that when there is a progress, it always starts by a divergence, because there is some part of the population which is more able to take advantage of the progress. It can be a medical progress or social progress or a lot of different things. And then when this part of the population has gained everything they could gain, the laggards are coming behind, and then there is a convergence. And I think we cannot avoid that if we look, and this is what you just said for this new maybe therapy on aging. In the same time, sometimes it's not the same parts of the population, so it can change. So in terms of geography, for instance, it was not always the same countries who benefited first from the progress, at least among the most advanced countries. And In the past, the Nordic countries were more in advance in terms of life expectancy, and they were the first to take advantage of the decrease of the infectious disease. When the cardiovascular revolution came, it was more in Europe, the countries of the south, which took advantage before the rest. So this can change. In terms of regions, it can also change. Unfortunately, in terms of socio-economic difference, it's always in the same direction. So it's always the most privileged part of the population which takes advantage of the progress, and it's very difficult to change that, I think. So it should be a fight for everybody. But it's very difficult because for cultural education reasons, this part of the population are usually more able to take the new things and to progress in that change. But in that sense, but of course, this is now some issue of health policy, just to try to help more the least advantaged part of the population to benefit more rapidly of some progress. But in a way, I just wanted to speak about a recent work we are doing with some of my INET colleagues and also BIB colleagues, so Florian Bonnet especially, and Pavel Grigoriev in the BIB, about the regional differences in mortality in the most recent years in Europe, and looking at really what we call the not three levels. So it's really some small regions inside each country of Western Europe, and about this, just to look if the stagnation of life expectancy or slowing down is the same in all, and of course it appears that it's not the same, and that we have really a new divergence in life expectancy among these subnational regions in Europe, while until the mid-2000s, there was a convergence, and this divergence is for two reasons. So the most advantage, the vanguard, let's say, the vanguard part is still progressing, so there is no slowing down in these regions, so they are really very regularly progressing, and in the same time, the less advantage are stopping or even decreasing in life expectancy. So there is two phenomena, and this is why it's not so easy. So just now we just looked at, I hope this paper will be soon published, but it shows that there is probably an increase in this inequality. Then the last, maybe the last point is the inequality between men and women, and on this part, at least right now, we are still in a period of convergence, again, in the most advanced countries. It's always like that. And so I don't know, but maybe with new progress against aging, and we could see again some divergence. Females could be more benefiting from this progress than males, but let's see.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, and about the metrics that we're using for this to measure the inequalities, the heterogeneity, not only between the inside of the population, but between populations. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Yeah, I think with regard to the metrics, that's a good point. I feel that, I mean, we inherited in some ways the use of the mean value, which is the life expectancy, just because that's what indicator we traditionally use early on to try to compare across settings, across countries. I feel that that indicator of mean values, life expectancies, are quite relevant, but I feel that we now, given that we are trying to look more into disparities and to inequalities, we need to look more at the full distribution, not only the mean, but also potentially the variability in those distributions. There has been quite a lot of work recently on comparing not only the values, as I said, mean values, but also comparing full distributions. And Christina and other people have done a lot of interesting work on how one can assess the full distribution, for example, of ages at death, how that can be compared across populations, and what can we say about those differences. That I feel is very important, because as we look at inequalities, one of the attributes of inequality of heterogeneity is precisely that when one has inequalities, the mean value might not look that bad, but that could be a result of offsetting mechanisms. One group is really high, the other one is relatively low, so on average, it's somewhere not that bad. So if one only looks at the mean, one is going to lose track of the extremes of the variability in that distribution, and I think that's what is important to consider. How that variability is being assessed, how much variability there is, and France was mentioned in the case of subpopulations within France. We see the same idea in the US when one looks at different subpopulation groups, whether they are defined by race, ethnicity, or whether they are defined by regions within the country. Even at the average level, one sees differences, and if one sees differences on the means, one can only imagine how the distributions underlying those means might look like. It is very likely that in some groups are highly beneficial, and that happens actually in the US. If one looks at the overall life expectancy, nowadays they consider kind of an outlier, because the US as a whole, life expectancy is quite different from the rest of the high-income countries. It's actually going down, it's very low relative to high-income countries. However, if one looks at life expectancy at the Northeast region, or in California, for example, life expectancy is like in other European countries. So it's a high heterogeneity, a high difference in life expectancy in the Northeast region, which is the region Boston, Massachusetts, New York, and all that area, relative to what one might observe, say, in the South, East-South area in the US, because of the heterogeneity that exists in those areas. So I think that we need to move away, perhaps, from looking at mean values and trying to look more at the full distribution whenever possible. But also, I think we need to start incorporating a lot of the indicators that are being developed by our colleagues in the biostatistics and epidemiological areas. I was mentioning briefly indicators along the lines of biological age. So those are quite useful indicators. What I'm not sure are useful is at the population level. So I'm not sure if when one gets predictions, because at the end of the day, these indicators of biological age, for example, are developed to be identified for individuals. What I don't know is whether one continues to observe differences once we aggregate them up and now we put them at the population level, whether those individual level differences that one seems to observe on underlying proteomics, metabolomics, methylation, whatever that indicator might be, whether that translates into differences at the population level. That's a different metric. And that's what I think we as demographers should not move away from those indicators, and in contrast try to use them and try to adopt them and try to see if they are useful for what we are trying to assess, which in our case is move away just from indicators along the lines of mortality and moving into the direction of indicators along the lines of underlying physiological deterioration, not necessarily disease value indicators, because the underlying physiological markers are not the same as being having a disease, right? So I think that's also important.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I just wanted to defend a little life expectancy. not really, but I think we have to keep it because it's a simple indicator which is rather easy to use and to compare from one country, and we have to complete it with other ones, but not to forget about life expectancy. And then I just also wanted to mention, if we come back to the stagnation of life expectancy, and what we didn't mention is that the stagnation is not the stagnation, but the slowing down in any case is probably written in the way life expectancy is computed. And we know that as now the deaths are occurring at older and older ages, progress have to be more and more important to get the same amount of gain in terms of life expectancy. And so it doesn't mean that the progress is slowing down, it's the indicator which is not exactly the good one, maybe the good one, or at least has to be looked at with caution, because except if we even so the progress should be very, very important to get the same gain as when it was there was this very important decrease in infant mortality, which had such a direct impact on life expectancy.
Let me just very quickly mention, thank you, Franz, for mentioning that. That's a really good point with regards to the life expectancy, and also how hard or how difficult it is to improve life expectancy once we reach high levels of life expectancy. For example, if one looks at what fraction of deaths or how fast mortality would have to decline to gain 1 year in life expectancy when one has a life expectancy already around the 80 years. So for instance, if I have a population with 80 years of life on average, and I want to move it forward to 81, only 1 year in life expectancy, it takes over 12% reduction in all-cause mortality. So it's a massive reduction. In contrast, if I have a population in which life expectancy is in the range of the 60s or 50s, I don't have to reduce mortality that much to increase it for 1 year. So what that basically means is the further we move to the right in terms of survival, the more complicated and the more difficult it is to continue to improve life expectancy, even if it is only by 1 year. Because now we need to reduce mortality by a more larger fraction, and it is precisely in those ages in which it is difficult to reduce mortality at older ages. So this is basically, for demographers, what we call the entropy of the life table. So basically means as we get to older age, to mortality with high life expectancy, the entropy becomes more and more difficult to work with.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open the microphone for the audience, so for the public here. I don't know if some of you have some thoughts about what we are discussing now. Or,
don't be shy.
Yeah.
Claudia.
Okay. Okay.
I have a very quick question, a very quick reaction, and I'm not a mortality scholar, so I think it was very interesting for me to listen, and you referring to the countries as high-income countries or advanced countries, something I did not hear, which is often heard in migration literature, is the north-south or south-north migration, and I tend to criticize the use of the global north or the global south as concepts, just as before we were using, I don't know, developed countries. And I was wondering, when you were discussing, Franz, the discussion, especially in terms of the populations and what it means to have subnational heterogeneity, but also within, groups heterogeneity and populations, I was just wondering if, in the case of mortality, the truth is still, even with the US as an exception, if the truth is still driven by rich countries versus not so rich, or if we should try to think about different regionalizations that maybe falls back into the global north and global south, or if we need, in the case of mortality, just like different types of divisions. But it was interesting to just see how, there's still this idea that advanced means richer and higher incomes, and we see that it's not necessarily the case when you think about subnational heterogeneity and what you said about Boston and so on.
Any other question?
Posso fazer em português?
Yeah.
Então, o câncer é uma doença que na verdade, um conjunto de doenças que tem aumentado em todo o mundo, independente do país, da condição socioeconômica, e afetando pessoas cada vez mais jovens. Isso é um dado que a gente já tem, né? E, ao mesmo tempo, a inequidade de acesso ao diagnóstico precoce e ao tratamento de última geração faz com que as populações que são socioeconomicamente mais vulneráveis tenham uma menor expectativa de vida e de cura, né? Na verdade, no câncer a gente nem fala de cura, a gente fala de remissão na maior parte dos casos, né? Então, o que vocês têm para discutir sobre isso com relação à questão de inequidade e de divergência ou convergência do ponto de vista dos países mais ricos ou dos países mais pobres que, no fim das contas, estão sendo afetados da mesma maneira, com relação à incidência, né? Mas o tratamento e o diagnóstico é cada vez mais difícil de manter um nível igualitário de acesso.
So we had even budget to have the best translator.
Yes.
So I think I'm going to translate, but also add some of my own ideas. So the question was how structural inequalities and access to care actually may have impact in the treatments in diseases as cancer, such as cancer. So cancer prevalence is higher everywhere, and it's also affecting younger and younger people now. And how these inequalities in access is affecting this, the possibility of reduce mortality due to cancer and to increase life expectancy in this. So I think it's okay.
Oh, new one.
I will ask to Jenny to translate also. No, I wish to ask about the funding and now to research in health issues. Like now Trump is cutting all fundings and not all, but now this crisis, the world crisis, and what about this with inequalities, the countries' inequalities also?
I think
I like the question of the inequalities and access to healthcare. I think it is in high-income countries, and I'm going to start with Claudia. I was loosely referring to low mortality and high-income countries. The most appropriate way, in my view, is to refer to by mortality, low mortality settings or high mortality settings, because low mortality doesn't necessarily translate to high-income countries. So I was just loosely referring to almost equating the two, but I think it's more appropriate to refer to them as low mortality or high mortality setting. So when I made the comment of trying to differentiate the two, just because the age pattern behind and the cause-specific pattern behind those countries would be quite different. In the low mortality setting, as I was emphasizing, most of the pattern would likely be mortality reductions at older ages if one wants to improve survival, overall survival, in contrast to high mortality settings in which we still have, in fact, that's the case in some Latin American countries, in which we have what they call it the double burden of disease sometimes, which means at the same time that we do have older adults and are fighting with older adult mortality, we continue to have childhood mortality and we continue to have maternal mortality, which is in contrast to the low mortality settings in which childhood mortality and maternal mortality is quite low. So that's why I was making kind of that distinction. And that brings me to the point of the inequalities, the access to healthcare. I think it's quite relevant, and one see that, for example, the US is one example of it. In the US, it's really hard to get access to healthcare unless one has a job, because in the US in particular, there is no market for a health insurance. So it is becoming a little more of a market that ones can have their own job, and then I go and buy my own policy. That didn't used to be the case. It is a little bit more now. So in the US, in order to have access to healthcare, you have to have a job, and not every single job will provide it. And sometimes when they do provide it, they sometimes can be fairly limited. So in the case of cancer, it's a good example because most companies know it's so expensive that not every company or not every health insurance will cover it. And when they do, they might have a limit. They might have a cap on how much it is covered. So we see differences in some of those conditions. in particular the ones that require quite a longer treatment and that require these highly specialized set of medications. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons, perhaps, for the U.S. being sort of such an outlier in terms of life expectancy. Because the other countries, the low mortality countries, seem to move a little more along the lines of continuous improvement. They all seem to be slowing down their improvements, and that includes countries that are fairly progressive in terms of their programs, social programs, such as the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, those countries that tend to provide fairly good access to healthcare regardless of the type of condition, more generally speaking. The last question regarding funding, that's a very worrisome issue. The people, some of us who work in the US, that has become very complicated to continue doing our work. We don't know what's going to happen going forward, but what we do know is that the model that we used to have of financing research in the US, I think is very likely to change. We don't know yet in which direction it will go, but it's likely to be disrupted. And a lot of the research is going to be disrupted along the way. So in my own university, I'm one of the directors of the POP Center that we have at UCLA. And as part of the director, we also have what we call a training grant, which is a funding mechanism that provides research funding for students, doctoral students. So in the last couple of months, completely arbitrary, the program was suspended. So we were unable to pay funding for the last 2 months to our graduate students. And then we already had selected students for this coming year, and we don't have funding to pay them. So that's just an example of one place in which we already have students already enrolled, students that are already working on dissertations that don't have any funding. So, and they were relying on having that funding to pay for the housing, meals and all that. And this is only one example of what's happening. I have also grants with other people in other places. Some of those grants were eliminated or suspended in some cases, so we don't know if they're going to be reinstated. So I think that's going to have a big impact not only in the US, but also potentially, globally, because some of us do work globally. Like it is my case that I do a lot of the work in Latin America. So I'm going to be somewhat restricted on what I can do, and even more restricted on what students I'll be able to take. So what I'm anticipating going forward is that it's going to be really hard for people in the US to take international students. Because it seems that it's even more so that whatever funding we get, it is restricted to US citizens or individuals who have a particular legal status in the US, which none of international students fall within that category. So that's, you can have an idea what impact that might have on going forward. I was a beneficiary from some of those programs. That's how I was able to get my PhD, because I got funding from the US. Some of us in the audience got funding to get to the US through this type of grants. And going forward, I'm not sure we're going to be able to continue doing it. So yeah, it is very worrisome.
Just to add rapidly, so not on that, because I am not able to comment, but on the question by Claudia, I agree with you and with Hiram that we should speak of low mortality countries, but in the same time, unfortunately, if you look at the correlation, most of these low mortality countries are high income countries, and right now it didn't change so much, and so let's see, there were always some outliers like Cuba, we spoke about it this morning, or Costa Rica, which were but it remains exceptions, I would say. And as also Hiram said, it shows that in most of the middle mortality or high mortality countries, we didn't speak of them too much today, because the issue was more about the limit of the progress, and in all these countries, so we could say fortunately there is still a lot of gains to, and we know how to to have these gains. It's again a question of, it's not a question of tools, it's a question of means and economic means and organization of the health system, but we have the answers to that, and then it's a question of policy. And for the question about cancer mortality and the way to give access to care for the less advantaged part of the population, I agree that there are some health system, and we have one in France, for instance, where theoretically it's as easy for people to access, but in the same time it's not only the access or the cost of the access, but it's, as I said before, the question of education, so just in terms of prevention about behavior, and also the familiarity with the health system and the ability to go directly to the best place and to see the specialist rapidly, or this sort of thing. And this is much more difficult, maybe less costly, but much more difficult to reach and to get.
So, I tell you a secret. When I started today, I asked Franz, like, okay, don't spend more than 8 minutes per question. And she said, no, I'm going to spend much less. Not true. But I think this is wonderful because that means that really sparked something in you and you were really like excited to talk about, and I think that was the idea of this. So thank you very much to Iram and Franz. It was very great to have you here, and this discussion was very fruitful. So thank you.